So before I dive into the message this morning, I want to just say last night was the first night that our family has had a chance to go out to eat in like 3 months. We took an opportunity to go to the barn with our Pennsylvania family. And I'll be honest, I was surprised at what I saw. And maybe it's because I have surrounded myself with people like you that I was so surprised. There were about 5 cars in the parking lot. We went at a time where we thought we might have to wait in order to be able to be seated to have a meal. And we were shocked that there was just nobody out. For the first time, I think in a long time, like towards the beginning, I think I got an understanding of how much people were living in fear and how much they were allowing their lives to just be completely wrecked by this virus. Last night was the first time in a long time that I have thought, wow, people are still scared. And I was surprised. Maybe you guys aren't surprised by that, but because I've been surrounded by people who have been living in faith and have just been going about life in a careful and a cautious manner and in a wise manner, but still yet just going about life, I was a bit surprised. I don't know if anyone else has had a similar experience or not. I was hoping, as much as I didn't want to wait in line, I was hoping that the places would be full, that people would be going about their lives again. And so I guess it made me reflect for a moment and say how thankful I am for everyone who is here, because I know that you are kind of going countercultural on this. You are willing to step out of, maybe even it's your own comfort zone too. There may be some here who this is still causing you some anxiety and some fear, and if it is, I'm going to encourage you to do what we've already been challenging multiple times this morning, is to look to the one who controls all things and to live your life in faith and not live in fear. And so I felt bad for our server who only had us as customers for her entire section. And we made sure we took very good care of her, tipped much, much more than what we normally would, but she deserved it because she's out there and she's serving. And so I just wanted to say, I appreciate you guys, all of you. And those of you that are at home, I know some of you are in a position where I've talked to a number of people this week that said, Pastor Dave, I'd have been there, but quite honestly, I got a little bit of a cough. And I know how people will perceive that. And I said, I understand. I really do understand. Or I have allergies, and so I needed to stay away, those types of things. So if you're at home, please know that we have said throughout the course of this that your spirituality is not determined by whether or not you walk through these doors. We do view church as a necessity. And I was talking with Pastor Kirk yesterday on the phone, and he's been doing his best to be wise and be safe working at a nursing home. And he said, I'm just really missing Christian community. Worshiping at home is not the same, and it's certainly not. I guess I want to say, for those of you that are tuning in online, if you've never been a part of a church family, I know there's some who are part of our church family who are at home, and I understand that. But if you think, hey, I'm tuning in and this is going to be my church, I just want to encourage you, whenever you get to the point where the Lord allows you to have a comfort level with being here, be a part of a church family, because we need each other. We need these times together. So that's for free. Now we'll get into today's message, and we're in Matthew chapter number 5, and we last week went through the 4th of 6 challenges where Jesus raises the bar and the expectations for his followers. We were challenged to be known as promise keepers, as truth tellers. So much so that your reputation goes before you, so that whenever you say yes, it means yes. Somebody doesn't need you to say, I swear to God I'll do that. Somebody doesn't need you to say, I swear on my life that I'll do that. I'll swear on this grave or that grave. Your word is good enough that when you say yes, it means yes. When you say no, it means no. We were challenged. Jesus challenged us to raise the bar of our expectations. Today we're in Matthew 5 once again, And we're going to start in verse number 38. We're going to read through verse 42. I'm only going to read verse 38 to start with. Then we're going to back up and look at the context to which Jesus was referring. And so we're going to go back to Exodus. So we're going to start in Matthew 5. If you're somebody that likes to get the passages quickly, just know here in a moment we're going to go back to Exodus chapter number 21. Okay, Matthew chapter number 5, starting in verse number 38, we read these words. It says, "You have heard," if you have a red letter edition of the Bible, these words are in red. "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth." So this is something that was, as all of our previous four have been, an Old Testament portion of the law that was given, and you've heard, and people were very familiar with what this was. And so before we get into the rest of how Jesus says, "You've heard, but I tell you," let's back up, and I want us to go back, and I want to see the context of why this law was given. Now, I already said we were going to go to Exodus 21. Those of you really familiar with your Bibles, you'll know Exodus 21. Well, that's right after Exodus 20. I know that Exodus 20 contains the 10 Commandments. And so, okay, if we're talking about a portion of the law and we're in Exodus 21, then we must be right after the 10 Commandments. And I wonder why additional laws were given other than the 10 Commandments. And the laws were given just the same as laws are given these days, right? To control to some extent the behavior of people. People are not naturally good. That may come as a shock to none of you, I'd imagine, right? You know that people aren't naturally good. No, we find out in Romans that we're all born with a sin nature. You didn't have to teach your kids how to have a bad attitude. That can come natural. You didn't have to teach them how to throw a fit. You didn't have to teach them how to lie to you eventually. You didn't have to teach them how to, when they hadn't studied enough, to consider the possibility of cheating on a test. You didn't have to teach them all of those things. And so there were laws that were put into place. And I would venture to say that when we read this, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Most of you have heard that. In fact, let me just ask you, how many of you have ever heard that? Eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Anybody? Yeah, almost everybody in here has heard that. And I would imagine that the large percentage of those who have heard that probably view that the same way the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and most of the people in that day would have viewed it as well. When you hear eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, you think of revenge. You think of retaliation. You think of getting even. You think of making sure you get your pound of flesh, so to speak. When you hear eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that's kind of what immediately comes to mind. Would it be a surprise then, when we go back to Exodus 21, that it actually has nothing to do with that? In fact, it's actually a preventative measure. You say, I don't know about that. Well, all right, well, let's just look at it together rather than you maybe taking my word for it. Let's go back to Exodus chapter number 21. So almost all the way back to the beginning of your Bible, Exodus chapter 21, and we're going to start in verse number 22. Now again, you'll know that Exodus chapter number 20 contained the 10 Commandments. Exodus chapter number 21 is putting forth some additional laws to regulate human behavior. You get to verse 22 and it says this: "If men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman, and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows." Now, I want to just pause there for a moment so that you make sure you see the last two words, or let's say three words. The court allows. We understand that the original, because we're about to get eye for eye, tooth for tooth, so just understand that the original giving forth of the law as it related to eye for eye, tooth for tooth, involved the courts. Okay? You can see that very clearly from verse 22. Let's go to verse 23. But if there is serious injury, so verse 22 indicated, listen, if nothing happens, they'll be fined, whatever the husband determines and the court allows. Verse 23 says, but if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life. Verse 24, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn. Verse 25, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So understand that in the original context of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, it is not, I have to get even. It was actually put forth to make sure that people didn't abuse the law or abuse their ability to get back at someone. And I want you to think about this because I think we can all understand this rather easily. I want you to picture two children in a room. One shoves the other. Does the other one say, oh, okay, well, since they shoved me this hard, that's all the harder I can shove them, because it's eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. And so everything has to be balanced. They shoved me this hard, I need to shove them that hard. No, what normally happens with children, shove this hard, throw fists, pushing down. You've probably all seen that video that made its way around of these. There's two twin girls, and there's this little boy. And they're arguing about whether it's raining or sprinkling. How many of you have seen that video? Not as many as what I would have thought. Wow, I thought like everybody had seen that video. I would have shown it for you this morning if I'd have known that not all of you have seen that video. Well, okay, so just picture this with me. It's so cute. And you can look it up on YouTube later, okay? Two girls here. They're on this side, a little boy on this side, and the little boy's like, my mom says it's sprinkling. And the girl is like, no, my mom says it's raining. And the boy says, but no, it's sprinkling. No, my mom says it's raining. And so they get going like this, and then eventually the one pokes the other one kind of in the face. All right, now you think that would be like, oh, okay, we're going to be done. No, they continue arguing. And then the girl pokes the boy like this. And he's like, oh, you poked my heart. You poked my heart. Watch the video. It's hilarious. But it's like there's this idea that whenever kids get together, they have the tendency not to just retaliate in kind. They have the tendency, now I know all of your children, if you have more than one child, I would imagine that as they have been growing up, they treat each other with equality. Okay, so if you shove me only this hard, then I only shove you this hard. And I balance that out. No, that's probably not the way it goes, right? The shove comes, and then the shove comes, and then it escalates like there till one of them goes screaming, Mom! Or teenagers. Let's go to you for a moment. And you're walking down the hall, and I know this doesn't happen anymore. You're walking down the hall, and somebody knocks books out of hand. It's like, oh, okay, well, I'll just knock your books out of your hand. Oh, well, since I knocked your books out of your hand and you knocked my books out, then eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, we're all even. No, if it goes from books to shove against the locker to throwing of punches to principal being called and teachers getting involved, things have a way of escalating, right? People in personal relationships don't typically say, oh, okay, well, you did this to me, so I'll just do that to you. All right, adults, you're not off the hook. Think about this for yourselves for a moment. You're driving down the road and somebody's driving a little too close. They're tailgating you. And so what do? You have to slow down. It's in the traffic laws. I have read it. Right? So no. So you're driving down the road, somebody's driving too close behind you, and you slow down. Now, you don't hit your brakes because that would be too obvious, right? You have to just naturally slow down to a point where you feel like you're provoking their anger. And it's like, all right, yeah, they know now. All right, and so I'm just going to keep driving 5 miles an hour under the speed limit because I was driving 3 miles an hour over. But if you're going to be that close to me, then I'm going to make sure that you have to go even slower. Well, then they decide, the person behind you, they're going to go and they're going to pass you. But you can't just allow that to happen. You then have to speed up so that the person passing you knows that you're irritated. And as the person gets beside you, you know, they decide to flip you the bird, and you decide you're going to speed up a little bit more. Well, they eventually get past you, and what do? They slow down too. And then this can escalate into road rage, and you find that there are people who get in fist fights, and you find that there are people who lose their lives because they are determined not just, oh, okay, you know what? Well, the law of retaliation says that since you were driving too close behind me, the next time I get to drive too close behind you. No, we have a natural tendency to escalate the situation. So laws were necessary to say you can't go beyond this point. The maximum punishment you can have is eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, an equality in the punishment. And so what this did was this allowed the court system to be fair and balanced. And you say, well, that's not our court system. Well, you're probably right about that to a certain degree. In fact, whenever I talk about, equal restitution or retribution or even retaliation, some of you probably are familiar with the 1992 case where this woman sued McDonald's because their coffee was too hot. How many of you were aware that there was someone who sued McDonald's because the coffee was too hot? And I would imagine that whenever you originally hear that, you think, now that's ludicrous. And she won an award of $3 million. And you say, oh my word. There is no balance in this. Now, I must be honest. I looked up this case this week, and I was kind of surprised because I would have had the same reaction as probably all of you have if you haven't looked into the case at all. So here's a little bit more detail on that case. I think I can sway your opinion. And you say, well, why are you trying to sway my opinion? Because what I'm trying to help you realize is the necessity of a law that said things need to be fair and balanced. There has to be a limit to retribution. So let me talk a little bit about that case to see if maybe you might be swayed possibly. So did you know that before this woman sued, there were 700 other reported cases of injury as a result of the McDonald's coffee being too hot? Did you know that in the McDonald's manual, it said to keep coffee at a temperature between 180 and 190 degrees? Did you know that any liquid at the temperature of 180 to 190 degrees will cause third-degree burns within 7 seconds of it contacting your skin? Now, you start to hear these things that, okay, they intentionally are keeping their coffee at a temperature which will knowingly cause harm. And at least when I look at that and I say, okay, well, they've been told this 700 times previously, your coffee's too hot, it's causing injury. Your coffee's too hot, it's causing injury. Your coffee's too hot, and they do nothing about it. You begin to have a little bit more of an understanding why a jury might say, okay, we're going to make McDonald's realize their coffee is too hot. Now, again, I have no care in the world as to whether you think the award is still too large or whether you might think it is too little. What I need you to at least understand is that going even back to the beginning of time, so to speak, shortly after, thousands of years ago, understanding the necessity of having laws in place which limited people's ability to retaliate. We need to also understand that this retaliation was not in personal interactions. The moment that we take retaliation, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and we put it into personal interactions, you know what you have made yourself? Judge, jury, and executioner. You have decided all of this for yourself. And so the law, the reason it's so important for us to see the context of this is that the law said, listen, if there is injury that takes place as a result of this, then in the court of law, here's the maximum retribution. Equality in the punishment that is measured out. What was happening, and this is what still happens today, is that we take this into all of our personal interactions. And we think, well, they did that to me, I'll do that to them. And Jesus is resisting that way of thinking. It is wrong, Jesus is about to say, to adopt that mentality, to say, okay, I have to get back. I have to get even. I have to hurt you in the way that you hurt me. You posted something about me on social media, I will post something about you on social media. You said something about me to the boss, I will say something about you to the boss. You did this to me, I will do that to you. And in our personal interactions, and this is what was taking place back then, everybody felt as if they had to get even. And it's into this context that Jesus speaks. And while I know that cultures differ wildly, and the culture back then would have been completely different than our culture today, the same general concepts seem to apply. And we need to understand as we go back to Matthew chapter number 5, that it's into this context of everyone wanting to get even, everybody feeling as if they had to have their rights. And I don't want to get into a discussion this morning about your rights, because your feeling about rights right now is very heightened. Everybody wants their rights, or depending, and maybe I'm just wrong about this, like I've thought that everybody wants their rights, and then I go to the barn last night and maybe nobody wants their rights, and I just don't know anymore, okay? But the reality is this, is that personally, we tend to want to fight for ourselves. So we go back to Matthew chapter 5, verse number 38. And we get to these words we already read. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Verse 39, we're going to continue to read the rest of the passage. But I, Jesus, tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. I'm going to add a bit of humor. At this point, you're like, if they strike me on the right cheek, I have to turn the other. Just strike me on the left, and I ain't turning nothing, man. Right? Let's read the Bible in the way that we want. It says, if they strike you on the right cheek, then turn the other. Well, just start with the left, and I won't turn anything other than my fist to your face. Okay? But it says, I'm telling you, Jesus says, don't resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile with him, go 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. As we look at these verses, and we're going to go back and we're going to start in verse number 39 and just kind of break these down. Jesus transitions from their understanding of what the law said to the raising of the bar, and he says, do not resist an evil person. Some versions, depending on what you're looking at, it might even just say, do not resist evil. And you say, okay, well, if no Christian resists evil, isn't evil going to abound everyone? Well, it's important that it's a major reason, and this verse is probably as good or any for a lesson on don't pull things out of context. What is the context? We've already established it. We went back to Exodus 21, and we saw in Exodus 21 that this was dealing in the courts. It was talking about in the courts there needs to be equal justice. It's not in a vacuum that Jesus just says, do not resist an evil person. In fact, when Jesus went in and he had the cords there and the whips, and he cleared out the temple, do you think he was resisting evil? He absolutely was. He was saying, this is my Father's house. How dare you make it a den of thieves? He didn't just throw up his hands and say, well, we can't have any conflict. We can't have any disagreement. You just go about doing your wickedness in the way that you want to do your wickedness. That's not what this passage teaches. That's to rip these verses and even just this portion of a verse out of context. It says, in the context of, you've heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. I want you to know that whenever somebody is coming against you and they are trying, and then he goes on and he lists a number of examples, I want you to know that your rights aren't nearly as important as your testimony. I titled this message, Testimony Over Triumph. Testimony over triumph. We have become a culture so consumed and concerned with personal rights and making sure that we get what we deserve, not from a punishment standpoint, but just from a rights standpoint. We become so consumed with that we don't see how our behavior is affecting those around us. We don't see how our behavior is affecting our testimony for Christ. We don't see all of those things. And so Jesus, in this context, he says, if there's someone with a legitimate complaint against you and they are seeking retribution, don't resist that person. Don't try to just get out of it. The law says eye for eye, tooth for tooth. It wasn't made for frivolous claims, because some people on this would go to an extreme. And they'd say, okay, well, I guess if somebody in some context wants to sue me, then I can't even offer any sort of resistance. That is to take the opposite extreme. And again, to not go with the context. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The law of retribution or retaliation said you can't retaliate more than the harm that was done to you. If there was no harm that was done, then does the law of retribution take effect? It can't. And so we're not talking about frivolous claims and just making Christians these weak doormats to be walked over at all times. That's not what this passage is teaching in the slightest. It says, listen, you've heard that it was said eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I'm telling you, don't resist that evil person. That person has to have a legitimate claim. We know that from the context. So don't feel like it's all about you. In the case with just about everything, those who are wrong, they don't even want just retribution. They want everything they can get. And Jesus is saying, don't fight against that evil person. Try to make it right as quickly as possible. Now, a couple of reminders, and I keep trying to say, I feel like this is one of the more well-known passages in Scripture, and yet, like, one of the most misunderstood. And so, if I keep repeating my points, it's because I want to make sure you get it in the right context. So again, a couple of reminders. Legitimate claim has to be made, and this legitimate claim is being carried too far. Don't fight for your rights to the nth degree. Okay, well, they're trying to get this, but I think that I could fight. If I fought them, then I could get this, and I could hold my ground and hold my rights. Value your testimony above triumph. Value your testimony above triumph. For a lot of people, a lot of Christians, you don't consider your testimony in your everyday life. And this morning, if you get nothing else out of this message, and I hope you get a lot, but if you get nothing out of it, consider this. Your testimony matters every single day. You should take into consideration your testimony, your Christian testimony, in everything you do. I would even maybe go so far as to say you should consider your Christian testimony, especially when you're being wronged. That's the major point of this passage. Everybody's trying to get what's even and making sure that they're holding their rights and doing. Your testimony matters at all times. In the context of what we're living today, can I just say this? Your testimony on Facebook matters. And if you don't think if you have a Facebook account, unless you just don't use it, which that is the case for some, if you have a Facebook account, you have a Facebook reputation. You do know that, right? I'm not the only one who understands how this works. I'm not the only one who, whenever I'm scrolling through Facebook and I go past the person's name so the name is hidden, but the post is still there, I'm not the only person who's able to know the name of the person without scrolling back up. Right? I'm not the only person that, okay, here's what the post says. I bet you I can guess who said that. Your testimony matters. And we've been living as a culture, and unfortunately, even as a Christian community, caring more about our rights and winning an argument or winning some sort of a debate than we ever care about our testimony in the world. And I just want to remind you that Jesus is challenging us here. Listen, you have heard that it was said, and the implication is this has become part of your culture. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You've heard that it's been said that. And it's gone into your personal relationships, and now everybody just wants to be even. And everybody wants to get back at somebody. And everybody wants to make sure that they have their rights. And he's saying, listen, value your testimony over winning. Think about your testimony in every single thing. This shouldn't even be a surprise that Jesus says this. Look back about 14 verses in your Bible. Now all of you are doing some math. Okay, so look about verse 25, Matthew 5:25. It says this: settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Now this is 14 verses before he says in verse 39, I tell you, don't resist an evil person. Verse 25 says, settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. There seems to be this recurring challenge that Jesus has. My followers are going to be known as, and I'm wondering if you can fill in that blank. And for this one, we're going to have to go back 16 more verses. So we've gone back 14 verses, we go back 16 more, and we find, wow, at the beginning of the sermon, it seems as if Jesus has said, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. My followers will be known as peacemakers. Peacemakers will be known as my children. That's what's going to be known about them. And there's this recurring theme throughout this sermon, not my sermon, but Jesus' sermon, is that, you know what? You're trying to fight for all this stuff. Realize this, they're living under the oppression of the Roman government. You think we have it bad? No, they had it much, much worse. Living under that oppression, they didn't have those freedoms that we have. And I'm not saying, just as I'm not saying that Christians should become doormats, because I know how easy it is to take things out of context. And you can take my words out of context and say, well, Pastor Dave says we shouldn't care about our rights. I'm not saying that either. I'm not saying that Christians have to just at all times throw up their arms and say, okay, well, we can't argue for what we think is right. We can't do. No, but in the context of personal relationships, what's it say here? Stop caring and defending so much. Why? My children are to be known as peacemakers. And you know what you've already gotten? You've already gotten your value established by God. Who you are is set long before there's a conflict. Jesus says, you are my children. You are loved. You are cared for. So make sure that you understand that long before somebody else challenges your reputation, challenges your identity. Let your identity be established firmly by the person and in the person of Jesus Christ. So with all this in mind, we keep in mind testimony over triumph. Peacemakers are Christians, and Christians are peacemakers. Settle matters quickly, verse 25. Jesus says into this context, I tell you what, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now this strike is not a punch. It would have been a backhanded slap. If you figure a person is facing you, and you can imagine if a person is facing me, and all of you are, if I would give you a backhand slap and they would typically use their right hand, which side of your face would that hit? It would hit your right side, correct? So understand that whenever they're talking about this, if someone strikes you, or some versions say slap you on the right cheek, it says turn to him the other. To strike or to slap somebody on a cheek, it was a Jewish form of an insult. You actually see this in the trial of Jesus. And Jesus says, if someone insults you by slapping you on the face, instead of insulting that person back by slapping them on the face, turn the other cheek and allow that person to assault you again. Then he says, if someone has cause to sue you for your tunic, which would have been the inner garment, a long t-shirt-like material that would have come down to about the knee. If someone has cause to sue you for your tunic, then make sure that full restitution is made. And not only that, make sure that even more is accomplished. Give him your outer coat or cloak as well. Make sure, Jesus is saying, that you have well satisfied the other party in this. Now again, this goes counter to our culture. Our culture is like, give as little as you possibly can. In negotiations, make sure you start out low, and then don't let them know what you actually... No, Jesus is saying here, make sure that you make full restitutions. I've mentioned this before. I get so bothered. I listen to radio a decent amount. I get so bothered by these credit card commercials on the radio that say this: don't let credit card companies trick you into thinking you have to pay all your money back. Say again? Don't let credit card companies trick you into thinking you have to pay all your money back. Well, no, you do. You do. That's your obligation, is to pay what you have owed. And so if someone sues you, and again, we need to remind ourselves, because if you take this out of context, only this verse, and you just read, hey, if someone sues you, then you ought to give them extra, then you were like, well, if it's a frivolous thing, I still have to. No, remind ourselves, context is so important. What's our context? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Well, how do you only have eye for eye, tooth for tooth? You only have eye for eye if there was first an eye that was damaged, then another eye would be damaged. It's an equal kind. So a frivolous thing never meets the first qualification. That's why, again, context is everything in God's word. So within this context, if somebody has reason to sue you, you've done something, whatever that might be, and they're suing you, it says, for the tunic, which again was the inner garment, kind of like a t-shirt material, about down to your knee. If somebody was going to sue you, you know what? Not only satisfy what legitimately you owe, go above and beyond to make sure that person is taken care of. Now, if we go back to the beginning part of the previous verse, even if that person's not the best in the world, even if that's an evil person. All right, well, it's into this context again that he goes into the next thing. It says in verse 41, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. In the Jewish culture, or not so much Jewish culture, but under the Roman rule, the law said that a Roman soldier could make any person carry his belongings, carry whatever he had, for up to 1,000 steps. We just marked that as a mile, but they could make you go 1,000 steps. Maybe a familiar instance where a Roman soldier would have caused just a regular citizen to have to carry a load that wasn't his own would be Simon, who carried the cross of Jesus. Whenever Jesus couldn't hold up under the weight of that, the Roman authorities had the ability to say to any individual citizen, you have to carry this for up to 1,000 steps. And what Jesus says here is, okay, The first 1,000 steps are an obligation. The second 1,000 steps are love. Think about that for a moment. If someone compels you to go 1 mile, if a Roman authority would say, hey, you have to carry my bags, you have to carry my luggage, you have to carry whatever it might be for 1,000 steps, you had to do that according to the law. But Jesus says, don't just do what the law requires. I want you to go an extra mile as well. The first mile is obligation. With every step of the next 1,000 steps, you are speaking love into that life. Can you imagine if the Christian community didn't just treat people who treated them well, didn't just treat them with love? Can you imagine if the Christian community started to live this out? Can you imagine if the Christian community started saying, you know what, I'm compelled to do this, but I'm going to go even farther in love. I'm going to go beyond what my obligation is. I'm going to make sure that this person knows I love them deeply. You say, but you don't even know that person. 2 Corinthians 5:14 says, the love of Christ compels us. It compels us. It's what drives us, because we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead. Like we live because Jesus died for us. And so the love of Christ is what compels us to love. And this is the next raising the bar. This is number 6. This is what compels us to love our enemies. Who does that? This is what compels us to pray for those who are ruining our reputation. This is what compels us to go the extra mile. It's love. And none of this should be a whole lot of a surprise, but unfortunately, even though this is one of Jesus' early teachings, and maybe even one of his more popular or well-known teaching, because it's so misunderstood and so countercultural and counter to self-indulgence, most Christians prefer to let's not live that one out. I mean, the phrases turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, they're widely used even outside of a religious context, right? You'll get people just in general society, well, just turn the other cheek. You know what? Go the extra mile. You hear those outside of a religious context, yet they're not lived out within the Christian life. My friends, this ought not to be. It ought not to be. It ought not to be that we as Christians don't live out this teaching. Now, we live this teaching out within the context of the teaching. Because again, I know how easy a message like this is. If you would just pull out a little snippet of something that I say in this message, I know that some people could come to the conclusion and say, Pastor Dave said that Christians should be doormats. That's not what this teaches. Pastor Dave said that we should adopt a pacifist way of thinking. That's not what this passage says. This passage says very clearly, in the context of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, someone has been wronged. If you've wronged someone, and the law says equal justice under the law, we don't just take that to personal relationships, but we need to understand that within that context, we go above and beyond. You run into and you damage somebody's car. The law would say you have to pay for that to get fixed, right? But what if there is something else? Let's say that you run into the front quarter panel and the law would say you have to pay to have that fixed and repainted. But the reality is that it's hard to get a perfect color match. And so beyond and going above and beyond, you say, you know what? If it doesn't match right, I'll go ahead and take care of the rest of the car. Pastor Dave, that's ludicrous. That would cost extra money. It would cost extra money, and it would increase the value of your testimony tenfold. Believe it or not, there are people who do things like this. There are people who say, okay, I don't want to just get by with my testimony. I don't want to make just sure that it's just kind of, okay, I did what was required. I want to make sure that someone is taken care of in my testimony. The testimony of Christ, as far as it relies on me, is going to be protected and enhanced. Last night, it did not escape my thinking that whenever we were at the Barn restaurant, it didn't escape my thinking that our waitress clearly saw us bow our heads and pray for the food we were about to eat. It did not escape my thinking that she knows she's not going to make any more money that night. And I don't imagine that as she was kind of taking care of her service that she was like, oh man, I really hope they tip the normal 20%. The only thing going through my mind in that time was not, well, how much money can I get away with giving? Was how can this lady know that our testimony for Christ cares about her? We see her as an individual. I don't know if she's a follower of Jesus or not. She was a really kind lady. She treated us really well. Funny story. So she had come and she had taken I had gotten sweet tea, and you get those little mason jar type things there at the barn. And so they don't last very long. That's like 3 swigs when you have ice in it. And so she had come and she had taken mine, and then, she was doing our order. She forgot to bring it back. And then she brought it back, and then I wiped it out pretty quickly again. She came, and they're not allowed to refill. They're not allowed to take them and bring them. They have to bring us a whole new glass. And so she brings me a sweet tea again, and I see her standing over there. She's just looking. And I'm like, I wonder what, either we maybe have done wrong, or wonder what she thinks she's forgot. Well, so I take a drink of my sweet tea again, and she walks over. She's like, is that sweet? And I'm like, I think so. I wasn't really paying attention when I was drinking. Are you guys like that too? I don't know, you just start drinking, and I don't really pay attention to what it tastes like. It just is what it is. It's a liquid, and so I'm like, I think so. And she's like, well, I got busy talking, and I wasn't sure whether I got your drink out of the sweet or the unsweet section. And so I'm standing over there looking at you thinking, is his face going to make a funny face? And it was sweet tea, but she cared so deeply. And all I mean from all of this is to say, from my heart, and everybody at our table, we have some Pennsylvania family that is here with us this weekend, and very, very privileged to have them here. I know that all of our thinking was the same. How do we make sure this lady knows that our testimony for Christ matters, that we care about her even though we don't know her? And this passage is all about forgetting about protecting your individual rights, because you can, and it's about making sure the testimony of Christ is protected. I would encourage you, look at this passage, look at the context, and consider how you're going to live this week. I had hoped to preach verses 43 through 48, but I am conscientious of the time with children with us this morning. And so I just want to leave you with this challenge. You know what? We don't, even as a Christian community, often live out, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. We don't often care about our testimony in most of life. Please consider that Jesus is challenging us to do so. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for allowing us to be challenged by it. I know that I personally am challenged by this, not just in relation to maybe the specific examples here, but in all, sure that my testimony for you and of you is enhancing your reputation in this community and in this world. May we all, as followers of Jesus, go forth from this place determined to say, you know what? I'm going to make sure, as far as it depends on me, that people are going to see Jesus this week. People are going to see Jesus in my words. People are going to see Jesus in my reactions. People are going to see Jesus in my behaviors. People are going to see Jesus in my facial expressions. People are going to see Jesus in my compassion. People are going to see Jesus in my love. People are going to see Jesus in me. Father, thank you for raising the bar of our expected behavior as your followers. Raising the bar to a point where we realize our testimony matters. Thanks, Jesus, for giving us the perfect example. Even as you went through your trial, you didn't respond. You didn't defend your reputation. In fact, one time, and we find this in the Gospel of John, one time you even said, just go ask others. I've taught in the synagogues. I've been open about everything. Just go ask others. Father, you sent your son Jesus, and his reputation was flawless. And God, I pray that you help us as your disciples, your followers, to care about our testimony for you. As much as it depends on me, Lord, help me to set a good example of who Jesus is. Challenge our hearts. May we leave this place different. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to invite you to stand. We're going to sing together.